Chapter 1. It was close to midnight when the single rider reined in his horse outside the small cottage set in the trees below Castle Redmont. The laden pack pony trailing behind the saddle horse ambled to a halt as well. The rider, a tall man who moved with the easy grace of youth, swung down from the saddle and stepped up onto the narrow veranda, stooping to avoid the low-lying eaves. From the lean-to stable at the side of the house came the sound of a gentle nickering, and his own horse's head rose as he answered the greeting. The rider had raised his fist to knock at the door when he saw a light come on behind the curtained windows. He hesitated. The light moved across the room and, a second or so later, the door opened before him. "Gillen," Holt said, without any note of surprise in his voice. "What are you doing here?" The young ranger laughed incredulously as he faced his former teacher. "How do you do it, Holt?" he asked. "How could you possibly know it was me arriving in the middle of the night, before you'd even opened the door?" Holt shrugged, gesturing for Gillen to enter the house. He closed the door behind him and moved to the neat little kitchen, opening the damping vent on the stove and sending new life flaring into the wood coals inside. He tossed a handful of kindling into the stove and set a copper kettle on the hot plate over the fire chamber, shaking it first to make sure there was plenty of water in it. "I heard your horse some minutes ago," he said. Then, when I heard Abelard call a greeting, I knew it had to be a ranger horse. He shrugged again. "Simple when you explained it," the gesture said. Gillen laughed again in reply. "Well, that narrowed it down to 50 people, didn't it?" he said. Holt cocked his head to one side with a pitying look. "Gillen, I must have heard you stumbling up that front step 1,000 times when you were studying with me," he said. "Give me credit for recognizing that sound once more." The young ranger spread his hands in a gesture of defeat. He unclasped his cloak and hung it over the back of a chair, moving a little closer to the stove. It was a chilly night, and he watched Holt measuring coffee into a pot with some anticipation. The door to the rear room of the house opened, and Will entered the small living room, his clothes pulled hastily on over his nightshirt, his hair still tousled from sleep. "Evening, Gillen," he said casually. "What brings you here?" Gillen looked from one to the other in something like despair. "Isn't anybody surprised when I turn up in the middle of the night?" he asked, of no one in particular. Holt, busy by the stove, turned away to hide a grin. A few minutes earlier, he'd heard Will move in hurriedly to the window as the horse drew closer to the cottage. Obviously, his apprentice had overheard Holt's exchange with Gillen and was doing his best to emulate his own casual approach to the unexpected arrival. However, knowing Will as he did, Holt was sure that the boy was burning with curiosity over the reason for Gillen's sudden appearance. He decided he'd call his bluff. "It's late, Will," he said. "You may as well go back to bed. We have a busy day tomorrow." Instantly, Will's nonchalant expression was replaced by a stricken look. The suggestion from his master was tantamount to an order. All thought of appearing casual departed instantly. "Oh, please, Holt," the boy exclaimed. "I want to know what's going on." Holt and Gillen exchanged a quick grin. Will was actually hopping from one foot to another as he waited for Holt to rescind the suggestion that he should go to bed. The grizzled ranger kept a straight face as he set 3 steaming mugs of coffee on the kitchen table. "Just as well I made 3 cups then, isn't it?" he said, and Will realized that he'd been having his leg pulled. He shrugged, grinning, and sat down with his 2 seniors. "Very well, Gillen. Before my apprentice explodes with curiosity, what is the reason for this unexpected visit?" "Well, it has to do with those battle plans you discovered last week. Now we know what Morgorath has in mind. The king wants the army ready on the plains of Uthal before the dark of the next moon. That's when Morgorath plans to break out through the 3-step pass." The captured document had told them a great deal. Morgorath's plan called for 500 Scandian mercenaries to make their way through the swamps of the Fenlands and attack the Araluan garrison at 3-step pass. With the pass undefended, Morgorath's main army of Wargals would be able to break out and deploy into battle order on the plains. "So Duncan plans to beat him to the punch," Holt said, nodding slowly. "Good thinking. That way, we control the battlefield." Will nodded in his turn and said in an equally grave voice, "And we'll keep Morgorath's army bottled up in the pass." Gillen turned slightly to hide a grin. He wondered if he had tried to copy Holt's mannerisms when he was an apprentice, and decided that he probably had. "On the contrary," he said, "once the army's in place, Duncan plans to withdraw, then fall back to prepared positions and let Morgorath out onto the plains." "Let him out?" Will's voice went up in pitch with surprise. "Is the king crazy? Why would—" He realized that both rangers were looking at him, Holt with one eyebrow raised, and Gillen with a quizzical smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I mean," he hesitated, not sure if questioning the king's sanity might constitute treason. No offense or anything, it's just—" "Oh, I'm sure the king wouldn't be offended to hear that a lowly apprentice ranger thought he was crazy," said Holt. "Kings usually love to hear that sort of thing." "But Holt, to let him out after all these years, it seems—" He was about to say crazy again, but thought better of it. He thought suddenly of his recent encounter with the Wargals. The idea of thousands of those vile beasts streaming unopposed out of the pass made his blood run cold. It was Holt who answered first. "Well, that's just the point, Will. After all these years. We've spent 16 years looking over our shoulders at Morgorath, wondering what he's up to. In that time, we've had our forces tied up, patrolling the base of the cliffs and keeping watch over Three Step. And he's been free to strike at us any time he likes. The Kalkara were the latest example, as you know only too well." Gillen glanced admiringly at his former teacher. Holt had instantly seen the reasoning behind the king's plan. Not for the first time, he understood why Holt was one of the king's most respected advisors. "Holt's right, Will," he said. "And there's another reason. After 16 years of relative peace, people are growing complacent. Not the rangers, of course, but the village people who provide men-at-arms for our army, and even some of the barons and battle masters in remote fiefs to the north. You've seen for yourself how reluctant some people are to leave their farms and go to war," Holt put in. Will nodded. He and Holt had spent the past week travelling to outlying villages in Redmont Fife to raise the levies of men who would make up the bulk of the army. On more than one occasion, they had been met with outright hostility that melted away as Holt exerted the full force of his personality and reputation. "As far as King Duncan is concerned, now is the time to settle this," Gillen continued. "We are as strong as we'll ever be, and any delay will only weaken us. This is the best opportunity we'll have to get rid of Morgorath, once and for all." "All of which still begs my original question," Holt said. "What brings you here in the middle of the night?" "Orders from Crowley," Gillen said crisply. He placed a written dispatch on the table, and Holt, after an inquiring look at Gillen, unrolled it and read it. Crowley was the commandant of the Rangers, Will knew, the most senior of all of the 50 Rangers in the Corps. Holt read, then rolled the orders closed again. "So, you're taking dispatches to King Swidned of the Celts," he said. "I assume you're invoking the mutual defence treaty that Duncan signed with him some years ago." Gillen nodded, sipping appreciatively at the fragrant coffee. "The king feels we're going to need all the troops we can muster." Holt nodded thoughtfully. "I can't fault his thinking there," he said softly, "but—" He spread his hands in a questioning gesture. If Gillen were taking dispatches to Celtica, the sooner he got on with it, the better, the gesture seemed to say. "Well," said Gillen, "it's an official embassy to Celtica." He laid a little stress on the last word, and suddenly Holt nodded his understanding. "Of course," he said, "the old Celtic tradition." "Superstition more like it," Gillen answered, shaking his head. "It's a ridiculous waste of time, as far as I'm concerned." "Of course it is," Holt replied. "But the Celts insist on it, so what can you do?" Will looked from Holt to Gillen and back again. The two rangers seemed to understand what they were talking about. To Will, they might as well have been speaking Esplanade. "It's all very well in normal times," Gillen said, "but with all these preparations for war, we're stretched thin in every area. We simply don't have the people to spare. So, Crowley thought—" "I think I'm ahead of you," said Holt, and, finally, Will could bear it no longer. Well, I'm way behind you, he burst out. What on earth are you two talking about? You are speaking Araluan, aren't you? And not some strange foreign tongue that just sounds like it, but makes no sense at all.